The winter of 1889 had been merciless to the Montana Territory. Snow fell in sheets across the rolling hills, and the wind carried a bite that could freeze a man's breath in his chest. Thomas Mackenzie pulled his coat tighter as he guided his horse through the deep drifts toward the small trading post at Crow's Nest. His lungs burned with each breath, and the cough that had been troubling him for weeks now came with flecks of blood. At 53, Thomas had seen his share of hard winters on the frontier. He had built his ranch from nothing but determination and sweat, carved alive from the unforgiving landscape that stretched endlessly in all directions. But this winter felt different. The sickness in his chest grew stronger each day, and he knew what the doctor and Helena had told him 3 weeks ago was true. The consumption was winning. The trading post emerged from the swirling snow like a beacon. Warm lights spilled from its frosted windows, and smoke rose straight up from the chimney in the still air. Thomas tied his horse to the hitching post and stamped the snow from his boots before pushing through the heavy wooden door. The heat hit him like a wall, and he had to lean against the doorframe as another coughing fit seized him. "Tom Mackenzie," called out Jake Morrison, the post's owner. "Didn't expect to see you out in this weather. That storm's only getting worse." Thomas nodded, catching his breath. "Needed supplies before I get snowed in for the week. Can't afford to run out of necessities." Jake studied his old friend's face with concern. The man looked thinner than when he had seen him last month, and there were dark circles under his eyes. "You feeling all right, Tom? You don't look so good." "Just the winter getting to me," Thomas replied, though they both knew it was more than that. He made his way to the shelves, gathering flour, coffee, and bacon. Most importantly, he picked up a bottle of laudanum from behind the counter. The opium-based medicine was the only thing that helped him sleep through the night anymore, the only relief from the constant pain in his chest. As Thomas paid for his purchases, the door burst open with a gust of cold air and snow. A young Native American woman stumbled inside, her traditional dress soaked through and her face pale with exhaustion. She carried a small bundle against her chest, and Thomas could hear the weak cries of a sick child coming from within the blankets. The woman looked around desperately, her eyes settling on Jake Morrison. "Please," she said in heavily accented English. "My daughter, she is very sick. The fever, it burns her up. I need medicine." Jake's expression hardened immediately. "You know I can't sell to your kind," he said coldly. "Store policy. You Indians got your own medicine man for that sort of thing." The woman's eyes filled with tears. "He is 3 days away. She cannot wait 3 days. Please, I have money." She pulled out a small leather pouch and poured several coins onto the counter. "I said no," Jake repeated firmly. "Now get out of here before you bring more trouble." Thomas watched the exchange with growing discomfort. The child's cries were getting weaker, and he could see the desperation in the mother's face. He recognized that look, the same one he had seen in his own wife's eyes 12 years ago when their son lay dying of scarlet fever. They had been lucky then, had access to doctors and medicine. This woman had neither. The young mother turned to leave, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. The bundle in her arms had gone quiet, and Thomas felt his heart clench. He knew that terrible silence, the way hope slowly drained from a parent's soul. "Wait," Thomas called out, surprising himself. The woman turned, hope flickering in her dark eyes. Thomas reached into his coat and pulled out the bottle of laudanum he had just purchased. It was his last bottle, the medicine that would ease his final days. Without it, the nights would be long and painful. But looking at this desperate mother and her dying child, he knew what he had to do. "This will help with the fever and pain," he said, placing the bottle in her trembling hands. "Give her just a few drops mixed with water, not too much. It's strong medicine." The woman stared at the bottle in disbelief, then looked up at Thomas with tears streaming down her face. "Why?" she whispered. "Why do you help me?" Thomas met her gaze steadily. "Because it's the right thing to do." Jake Morrison watched in stunned silence as Thomas gathered his other supplies. "Tom, what are you doing?" "That's your medicine. You need that." Thomas shrugged, though the movement sent a spike of pain through his chest. "Girl needs it more than I do." The native woman pressed the bottle to her chest like it was made of gold. "I am Sarah White Dove," she said formally. "My daughter is Little Moon. We are of the Blackfoot people. I will not forget this kindness." "Thomas Mackenzie," he replied with a nod. "I hope your daughter gets better soon." Sarah hesitated for a moment, then reached into her bag and pulled out a small leather cord strung with a single eagle feather and a piece of polished stone. "This is blessed," she said, offering it to Thomas. "For protection and healing. It is all I can give you now, but it is given with a grateful heart. Thomas accepted the simple gift, feeling the smooth warmth of the stone against his palm. Thank you. As Sarah White Dove disappeared back into the storm with her daughter, Jake shook his head in disgust. Tom, you just gave away your last bottle of medicine to an Indian. What's Helen going to say about that when she finds out? Thomas pocketed the small charm and picked up his supplies. Helen was his sister who lived in Helena, the only family he had left. She would probably scold him for his foolishness, but he could live with that. Helen doesn't need to know, Thomas said simply. Some things a man just has to do. The ride back to his ranch was brutal. The storm had intensified, and the wind drove the snow like bullets against his face. Thomas could barely see 10 feet ahead, and he had to trust his horse to find the way home. By the time he reached his small cabin, he was exhausted and coughing worse than ever. Inside, the fire had died down to glowing embers, and the cold seemed to seep through the very walls. Thomas rebuilt the fire with shaking hands, then collapsed into his chair by the hearth. The pain in his chest was a constant throb now, and without the laudanum, he knew the night would be unbearable. But every time he thought about the medicine he had given away, he saw Sarah White Dove's face and heard her daughter's weak cries. He had made the right choice, even if it meant his own suffering would be worse. The storm raged for 3 days. Thomas barely left his bed, racked with fever and coughing fits that left him gasping for breath. He drifted in and out of consciousness, sometimes dreaming of his late wife Martha and their son David, who had died so young. Other times he found himself thinking about the young native woman and wondering if her daughter had survived. On the third night, when the storm finally began to ease, Thomas felt death approaching like an old friend. His breathing was shallow and labored, and a strange peace settled over him. He had lived a good life, had treated people fairly, and had done what he could to help others. If this was his time, he could accept it. But, as he lay there in the darkness, his fingers found the small charm Sarah had given him. The stone felt warm against his skin, warmer than it should have been in the cold cabin. He thought about her words, blessed for protection and healing. Thomas didn't put much stock in such things, but there was something comforting about holding it. The wind howled around the cabin, but gradually Thomas became aware of another sound. It was rhythmic and steady, like drumming. At first he thought it was his imagination, a fever dream brought on by his illness. But, as he listened more carefully, he realized the sound was real and getting closer. Thomas struggled to sit up in bed, straining to hear through the storm. The drumming was definitely approaching his cabin, accompanied now by what sounded like chanting. Through his frost-covered window, he caught glimpses of flickering light moving through the trees. Who would be out in weather like this? And why were they coming to his isolated ranch in the middle of the night? As the sounds grew louder, Thomas realized with a mixture of fear and wonder that his quiet act of compassion 3 days ago had set something in motion that he never could have imagined. The medicine he had given away was about to return to him in a form he never would have expected, carried by people whose ancient wisdom ran deeper than anything he had ever known. The drumming stopped just outside his door, and, in the sudden silence, Thomas held his breath and waited to see what the dawn would bring. The first light of dawn crept through the storm clouds as Thomas Mackenzie lay motionless in his bed, listening to the silence that had followed the mysterious drumming. His fever-addled mind wondered if he had imagined it all, the rhythmic beating, the chanting voices, the flickering lights moving through the trees. But then he heard it, a gentle but firm knocking at his door. Thomas struggled to sit up, his body protesting every movement. The consumption had weakened him considerably over the past 3 days without his medicine, and even the simple act of standing made him dizzy. He grabbed his rifle from beside the bed, not out of hostility but from the ingrained caution of a man who had lived alone on the frontier for decades. "Who's there?" he called out, his voice hoarse and barely above a whisper. "I am Joseph Running Bear," came the reply in accented but clear English. "Medicine man of the Blackfoot people. I have come to speak with Thomas Mackenzie." Thomas felt his heart skip a beat. A medicine man? Here? He slowly made his way to the door, using furniture to steady himself. Through the small window, he could see several figures standing in his yard. They were Native Americans, wrapped in heavy buffalo robes and blankets, their breath forming clouds in the cold morning air. "What do you want?" Thomas asked, his hand still on his rifle. "Sarah White Dove is my daughter," the voice replied. "You gave medicine to save my granddaughter's life. Now I have come to save yours." Thomas stared at the door in amazement. Sarah's father was a medicine man, and He had traveled through the worst storm of the winter to reach this remote cabin. The implications of this began to sink in as Thomas slowly unlatched the door and pulled it open. The man standing on his threshold was unlike anyone Thomas had ever seen. Joseph Running Bear appeared to be in his 60s, with long gray hair braided with feathers and beads. His weathered face spoke of a lifetime of wisdom and experience, and his dark eyes seemed to look right through Thomas to his very soul. Despite his age, he stood straight and strong, showing no signs of fatigue from what must have been a grueling journey. Behind him stood 4 other men, all younger but equally imposing. They carried leather bags and bundles, and Thomas could see the remains of a small fire where they had apparently camped just beyond his property line. "Thomas Mackenzie," Joseph said, studying the sick man with keen eyes. "You are very ill." "I'm dying," Thomas replied bluntly, too tired for pleasantries. "But I don't understand why you've come all this way. Your granddaughter, is she all right?" Joseph's stern expression softened slightly. "Little Moon lives because of your kindness. The fever broke on the 2nd day, and she grows stronger each hour. Sarah told me of your sacrifice, how you gave your last medicine to a stranger, knowing you would suffer for it." Thomas leaned against the doorframe, feeling weak. Any decent person would have done the same. "No," Joseph said firmly. "Many would not. I have lived 67 winters, and I have seen the hearts of many men, both white and native. What you did was not common decency. It was the act of a warrior's spirit, one that honors the sacred connection between all living things." The old medicine man gestured to his companions. "These are my helpers. We have brought medicine and healing songs. But first, you must understand something. Among my people, a debt of life can only be repaid with life. You saved my granddaughter. Now I will save you, if you will let me." Thomas found himself caught between disbelief and desperate hope. He had heard stories of Native American medicine men and their supposed powers, but he had always dismissed them as superstition. Yet here stood this dignified man who had risked his life traveling through a blizzard to help a complete stranger. "I don't have any money to pay you," Thomas said weakly. Joseph's eyes crinkled with what might have been amusement. "The spirits do not accept white man's coin. You have already paid the only price that matters. You showed compassion when hatred would have been easier." As if to emphasize his words, another coughing fit seized Thomas, leaving him gasping and specks of blood on his lips. Joseph stepped forward without hesitation and caught Thomas's arm, steadying him. "You will die within 2 days if nothing is done," Joseph said matter-of-factly. "The sickness in your lungs spreads like fire. But it is not too late. Will you trust me?" Thomas looked into the old man's eyes and saw nothing but sincere concern and quiet confidence. What choice did he have? The nearest doctor was days away, and he was far too weak to make such a journey. "What would you need to do?" Thomas asked. "First, we must cleanse the sickness from your body and spirit. Then, we will use the medicine plants to heal your lungs and give you strength. It will take 3 days, and you must follow our ways exactly. Can you do this?" Thomas thought of his comfortable skepticism about native remedies, his ingrained prejudices about savage ways. But then, he remembered Sarah White Dove's desperate face and the trust she had shown in accepting his help. If he could trust her, surely he could trust her father. "Yes," Thomas said simply. "I'll trust you." Joseph nodded approvingly and spoke in rapid Blackfoot to his companions. They immediately sprang into action, bringing their bundles into the cabin and beginning to transform the simple space into something that felt almost sacred. 2 of the men started building up the fire while another began arranging various plants, roots, and powders on Thomas's kitchen table. The 4th man, who appeared to be the youngest, began mixing something in a small clay pot, filling the cabin with a sweet, earthy smell. "First, you must drink this," Joseph said, offering Thomas a cup filled with a dark, bitter-smelling liquid. "It will make you very sick for a short time, but it will drive the poison from your body." Thomas accepted the cup without hesitation and drank it down in one gulp. The taste was awful, like dirt mixed with pine needles, and something he couldn't identify. Almost immediately, his stomach began to churn. "Good," Joseph said, guiding Thomas back to his bed. "Now we wait for the cleansing to begin." Within an hour, Thomas was violently ill. He vomited repeatedly, bringing up what seemed like everything he had eaten for the past week. Joseph and his helpers took turns staying beside him, offering him small sips of water and supporting him when the retching became too severe. "This is necessary," Joseph explained during one of Thomas's brief respites. The sickness is not just in your lungs, it is in your whole body. We must force it out before we can heal what remains. As the day wore on, Thomas felt as though he was dying. But, gradually, the violent illness began to subside, leaving him weak, but somehow cleaner than he had felt in months. The constant ache in his chest seemed less severe, and his breathing came a little easier. Now we begin the real healing, Joseph announced as evening approached. The medicine man had his helpers arrange stones around Thomas's bed in a specific pattern, then began burning various herbs and plants in a small metal bowl. The smoke filled the room with a complex mixture of scents, sage, sweetgrass, and other plants Thomas couldn't identify. Joseph began to chant in his native language, his voice rising and falling in a hypnotic rhythm. The other men joined in, creating a harmony that seemed to resonate in Thomas's bones. Despite his weakness, Thomas found the sound oddly comforting, like a lullaby that spoke to something deep in his spirit. As the chanting continued, Joseph placed his hands on Thomas's chest and began to massage specific points, applying pressure that seemed to loosen the tightness in his lungs. Thomas could feel heat radiating from the old man's hands, and gradually his breathing became easier than it had been in weeks. "Sleep now," Joseph said softly as the chanting died away. "Tomorrow we will do more." Thomas slept more peacefully that night than he had since his illness began. He dreamed of running through green meadows without any pain in his chest, of breathing clean, sweet air that filled his lungs completely. When he woke the next morning, he felt weak but alert, and the constant burning sensation in his chest had diminished to a dull ache. Joseph was already awake, sitting cross-legged beside the fire and preparing another mixture of medicines. He looked up as Thomas stirred and smiled. "You look better, my friend. The poison is leaving your body, but we still have much work to do." The second day brought more treatments. Joseph had Thomas inhale steam from boiling herbs, applied poultices to his chest, and gave him small amounts of various plant medicines throughout the day. Each treatment seemed to bring a little more relief, a little more clarity to Thomas's breathing. But more than the physical healing, Thomas found himself profoundly affected by the kindness and dedication of these men who had traveled so far to help him. They took turns watching over him, brought him food, and treated him with a respect and care he had rarely experienced. "Why are you doing all this?" Thomas asked Joseph during one of their quiet conversations. "I mean, I understand about repaying a debt, but this seems like much more than that." Joseph considered the question carefully before answering. "Among my people, we believe that all life is connected. When you saved Little Moon, you became part of our family, part of our circle. We do not abandon family, no matter what their skin color or where they come from. But your people and mine, we haven't always been friendly to each other." "No," Joseph agreed sadly. "There has been much hatred and killing on both sides. Many of my people see only enemies when they look at white faces. But I have learned that hatred is a poison that kills the one who carries it. You showed us that not all white men are our enemies. Perhaps we can show you that not all native people are yours." As the evening of the second day approached, Thomas realized that something remarkable was happening. Not only was he breathing easier, but he felt stronger and more hopeful than he had in months. The medicine man's treatments were working, but more than that, he was experiencing something he had never expected, a genuine friendship across cultural lines that had seemed impossible to cross. Joseph noticed his improved condition and nodded with satisfaction. "Tomorrow will be the final day of treatment. If the spirits are willing, you will be healed. And if they're not willing?" Joseph's expression grew serious. "Then, at least you will die with honor, knowing that you tried to bridge the gap between our peoples. But I do not think the spirits will let you die, Thomas Mackenzie. They have plans for you yet." As Thomas drifted off to sleep that night, he fingered the small charm that Sarah White Dove had given him. The stone seemed warm against his skin, and he found himself wondering what plans the spirits might have for a dying rancher who had given away his last bottle of medicine to save a native child's life. The answer would come with the dawn of the third day. The third day dawned clear and cold, with sunlight streaming through the cabin windows for the first time in nearly a week. Thomas Mackenzie woke feeling better than he had in months. The crushing weight in his chest had lifted considerably, and he could draw deep breaths without the sharp pain that had plagued him for so long. Joseph Running Bear was already preparing for what he called the final ceremony. He had arranged his helpers in gathering fresh pine boughs and specific stones from the creek that ran behind Thomas's property. The old medicine man himself seemed different today, more focused, more ceremonial in his movements. Today we complete the healing, Joseph announced as Thomas sat up in bed. But first, you must understand something important. The medicine we have given you can heal your body, but true wellness comes from harmony between body, mind, and spirit. You have been carrying sadness in your heart for many years. This sadness feeds the sickness. We must address this too. Thomas felt uncomfortable with this direction. He was a practical man who dealt in cattle and land, not emotions and spirits. I don't know what you mean. Joseph studied him with those penetrating dark eyes. You lost a wife and child. You have lived alone with your grief for 12 years, letting it eat at you like cancer. When Sarah told me about your kindness to Little Moon, she also told me about the look in your eyes. She recognized it because she saw the same look in her own mirror after her husband was killed by soldiers 5 years ago. The words hit Thomas like a physical blow. He had worked so hard to bury those memories, to build walls around the pain of losing Martha and David. Now this stranger was bringing it all to the surface again. That's in the past, Thomas said quietly. Nothing can change what happened. No, Joseph agreed. But carrying the pain like a stone in your heart will kill you as surely as the lung sickness. Sarah learned this truth. That is why she could risk trusting a white stranger with her daughter's life. She had learned to let the pain flow through her, instead of holding it like poison inside. Joseph's helpers had finished their preparations, and were waiting respectfully for their leader's instructions. The old medicine man gestured for Thomas to join them by the fire, where they had arranged the pine boughs in a circle around several heated stones. This is a sweat lodge ceremony, Joseph explained. We will build a small lodge here in your cabin using blankets and the pine branches. Inside, you will sweat out the last of the physical poison, but you will also have the chance to speak to the spirits of your wife and son. They have messages for you. Thomas felt a chill run down his spine. I don't believe in talking to the dead. Belief is not required, Joseph said gently. Only willingness to listen. Your grief has built a wall between you and the world of the living. Today we will help you tear down that wall. Despite his skepticism, Thomas found himself agreeing to participate. Something about Joseph's quiet confidence and the profound improvement in his health over the past 2 days had earned his trust. If the old medicine man said this was necessary, then perhaps it was. The helpers quickly constructed a small enclosed space using blankets stretched over a frame of pine branches. Hot stones were placed in the center, and Joseph sprinkled them with water infused with sacred herbs. Steam immediately filled the small space with a cleansing, aromatic mist. Thomas found himself sitting cross-legged across from Joseph in the makeshift sweat lodge, while the other men stationed themselves outside to maintain the ceremony. The heat was intense but not uncomfortable, and the sweet-smelling steam seemed to clear his head in ways he hadn't expected. Now we call upon the spirits, Joseph said, beginning a low chant in Blackfoot. We ask them to help Thomas Mackenzie release his burden of grief so that his healing can be complete. At first, Thomas felt foolish sitting there in the steamy darkness, listening to the old man's chanting. But gradually something shifted. The heat and the rhythmic sounds began to relax him in ways he had never experienced. His mind became quiet, and memories began to surface that he had kept buried for years. He found himself thinking about Martha's laugh, the way she had hummed while cooking dinner. He remembered David's excitement when Thomas had taught him to ride, the boy's determination to be just like his father. These weren't the painful memories of their deaths that usually haunted him, but the joyful memories of their lives. Tell me about them, Joseph said softly, somehow sensing the direction of Thomas's thoughts. Martha was the strongest woman I ever knew, Thomas heard himself saying. She came west with me when everyone said it was foolish, helped me build the ranch from nothing. She could deliver a calf, mend a fence, and still have dinner ready when I came in from the range. And your son? David was 8 when the scarlet fever took him. Brave as a lion, that boy. Even when he was dying, he was more worried about making his mother cry than he was about himself. Thomas's voice broke slightly. I should have been able to save them. A man should be able to protect his family. Ah, Joseph said knowingly. Now we reach the heart of your sickness. You carry guilt along with your grief. You believe their deaths were your failure. The words hung in the steamy air like an accusation. Thomas had never admitted this belief to anyone, barely even to himself. But it was true. For 12 years, he had carried the weight of feeling that he had somehow failed as a husband and father. The fever came so fast, Thomas whispered. First David, then Martha. I rode for the doctor, but the river was flooded. By the time I got back with help, they were both gone. If I had been faster, if I had left sooner. Listen to me carefully, my friend, Joseph said, his voice cutting through Thomas's anguish like a blade. The spirits of the dead do not want the living to carry guilt for things beyond their control. Your wife and son would be heartbroken to know that their deaths have been slowly killing you all these years. As if summoned by the old man's words, Thomas suddenly felt a presence in the sweat lodge that made his heart skip. It was subtle at first, just a sense that they were no longer alone. But, gradually, the feeling grew stronger, more distinct. Martha, Thomas whispered, feeling foolish but unable to stop himself. The response came not as a voice, but as a flood of emotion and memory so powerful it nearly knocked him over. He felt his wife's love surrounding him like a warm embrace, along with a profound sadness for the lonely years he had spent without her. But, more than anything, he felt her forgiveness and her urgent desire for him to live fully again. She wants you to know that you gave her and David the best life you could, Joseph translated, somehow able to sense what Thomas was experiencing. She is proud of the man you are and the kindness you showed to Sarah and little Moon. But she grieves for the way you have punished yourself. Now Thomas felt another presence, younger, more exuberant. David's spirit seemed to dance around him like a playful wind, full of the energy and joy he had possessed in life. Your son says you taught him how to be brave, Joseph continued. Now he wants to teach you something, how to let go of fear and embrace life again. He says there are people who need your help, just as little Moon needed your medicine. The emotions flooding through Thomas were overwhelming. 12 years of suppressed grief poured out of him in great, wrenching sobs. But, mixed with the sadness was a profound sense of release, as if a dam had burst inside his chest. Joseph placed a gentle hand on Thomas's shoulder and continued speaking in a voice that seemed to come from very far away. They want you to understand that love does not end with death. The love you shared with them still lives in your heart, but it has been trapped by your guilt and grief. When you free that love, it can flow to others who need it. As the ceremony continued, Thomas experienced something he had never expected, a genuine conversation with the spirits of his wife and son, not in words, but in feelings and images that were clearer than any spoken language. They showed him glimpses of a future where his loneliness might end, where his experience and wisdom could help others, where the love he had thought was lost forever could find new expression. When the sweat lodge ceremony finally concluded and they emerged into the cool air of the cabin, Thomas felt as though he had been reborn. The physical symptoms of his consumption had continued to improve, but, more importantly, the crushing weight of grief and guilt that had been slowly killing him for 12 years was gone. How do you feel? Joseph asked, studying Thomas's face with satisfaction. Different, Thomas said, searching for the right words. Lighter, like I can breathe for the first time in years, and not just because of the medicine. Joseph nodded. The healing of the spirit is always more important than the healing of the body. Your lungs will continue to get stronger now that your heart is no longer poisoning them with grief. As the day progressed, Joseph's helpers began packing up their medicines and supplies. The old medicine man spent time teaching Thomas how to prepare certain herbal remedies that would help maintain his health, and he left him with enough dried plants to last through the winter. Will I see you again? Thomas asked as they prepared to depart. Perhaps, Joseph said with a mysterious smile. But our paths are connected now, regardless of whether we meet in person. You saved my granddaughter's life, and, in doing so, you saved your own. The spirits have plans for both of you. As the medicine man and his helpers mounted their horses and prepared to ride back to their people, Joseph turned back to Thomas one final time. Remember what you learned today, he said. The medicine that heals one person can heal many, but only if it is given freely and without expectation of reward. Your journey is far from over, Thomas Mackenzie. As the small group disappeared into the afternoon shadows, Thomas stood in the doorway of his cabin feeling like a completely different man than the one who had been dying there just 3 days earlier. The physical healing was remarkable enough, but the spiritual transformation was even more profound. For the first time in 12 years, he found himself looking toward the future with hope instead of simply enduring each day as it came. Joseph was right. The spirits clearly had plans for him. But what those plans might be, he could not yet imagine. The answer would begin to unfold sooner than he expected, starting with a visitor who would arrive at his door before the week was over. 3 days after Joseph running bare and his helpers had departed, Thomas Mackenzie was chopping wood behind his cabin when he heard the sound of approaching horses. His strength had returned remarkably quickly, and he found himself able to work for hours without the crushing fatigue that had plagued him for months. The herbal medicines the medicine man had left were working better than any doctor's prescription ever had. Thomas set down his axe and walked around to the front of his property, shading his eyes against the bright winter sun. Two riders were approaching, a white man in a heavy coat and hat, followed by someone Thomas recognized with surprise. It was Sarah White Dove, sitting straight and proud on a spotted pony. The white man dismounted first, and Thomas recognized him as Dr. William Patterson from Helena. Thomas had met him briefly during his last trip to town for medical supplies. "Mr. Mackenzie," Dr. Patterson called out as he approached. "I hope you don't mind the intrusion. I've come to check on you after hearing some rather extraordinary reports." Thomas glanced at Sarah, who remained mounted but nodded respectfully in his direction. "What kind of reports?" "Well, according to this young woman, you were dying of consumption just a week ago, but you've made a miraculous recovery. As a man of science, I find such claims rather difficult to believe. I thought I should examine you myself and determine what actually happened." Thomas felt a flicker of irritation. He could guess what the doctor was thinking, that Sarah was either lying or that Thomas had never been seriously ill in the first place. The medical establishment had little patience for native healing practices. "Sarah White Dove," Thomas said, addressing her directly. "It's good to see you again. How is little Moon?" Sarah's serious expression broke into a warm smile. "She is well, thanks to your medicine. She grows stronger every day and asks often about the kind white man who saved her life." Dr. Patterson looked back and forth between them with growing confusion. "You two know each other?" "Mr. Mackenzie gave his last bottle of laudanum to save my daughter when she was dying of fever," Sarah explained. "Then, my father, Joseph Running Bear, came here to heal him in return." "Your father is the medicine man who supposedly treated Mr. Mackenzie?" Dr. Patterson asked skeptically. "There's nothing supposed about it," Thomas interjected firmly. "Joseph Running Bear and his helpers spent 3 days here, and they saved my life using traditional native medicine. I was dying, Dr. Patterson, and now I'm not. That's not superstition, that's fact." Dr. Patterson pulled a leather bag from his horse and approached Thomas with professional determination. "Well then, let's have a proper examination and see what we're dealing with. If you've truly recovered from consumption, there should be clear evidence." Thomas submitted to the examination, allowing the doctor to listen to his lungs, check his pulse, and ask detailed questions about his symptoms. As the examination progressed, Dr. Patterson's skeptical expression gradually changed to one of amazement. "This is extraordinary," he finally admitted, stepping back from Thomas with a puzzled frown. "Your lungs are clear, your breathing is strong, and you show no signs of the advanced consumption that should have killed you by now. I've been practicing medicine for 20 years, and I've never seen anything like this." "Native medicine has been healing people for thousands of years," Sarah said quietly. "Just because white doctors don't understand it doesn't mean it doesn't work." Dr. Patterson turned to study her with new interest. "What exactly did your father do? What treatments did he use?" Sarah looked to Thomas for permission before answering. When he nodded, she began to describe the 3-day healing process, the herbal purgatives, the steam treatments, the chest massages, and the various plant medicines. Dr. Patterson listened intently, occasionally asking for clarification about specific procedures. "Fascinating," he murmured when she finished. "Some of these treatments actually make medical sense. The steam therapy would help clear the lungs, and many plants do have genuine medicinal properties. But the speed of recovery you describe should be impossible. Maybe the problem is that you're trying to understand it only with your mind," Thomas suggested. "Joseph told me that true healing involves the spirit as well as the body. He helped me release grief and guilt that had been poisoning me for years." Dr. Patterson looked uncomfortable with this spiritual dimension, but he couldn't argue with the results he was seeing. "Whatever the mechanism, this is a remarkable recovery. Would it be possible for me to meet this medicine man? As a physician, I'd be very interested in learning about his methods." Sarah exchanged a look with Thomas before answering. "My father does not usually meet with white doctors. There has been too much suspicion and hostility between your people and ours. But perhaps," she paused, considering, "perhaps if he knew that some white medical men were truly interested in learning rather than just criticizing, he might be willing to talk." "I would very much like to learn," Dr. Patterson said earnestly. "I've studied medicine in the finest schools in the East, but I've never seen healing like this. If native medicine has techniques that could help my patients, I want to understand them. Thomas found himself stepping into an unexpected role as mediator. Dr. Patterson, what if I arranged a meeting between you and Joseph Running Bear? Sarah could translate if needed, and we could discuss how native and white medicine might work together instead of in opposition. The idea was revolutionary for its time. The year 1889 was marked by deep suspicion and often outright hostility between white settlers and Native Americans. The concept of cooperation in medical matters was almost unthinkable to most people on both sides. But Thomas had experienced firsthand the power of native healing, and he had also seen the genuine curiosity and respect in Dr. Patterson's eyes. Maybe it was possible to build bridges between these two very different approaches to medicine. I would need to speak with my father first, Sarah said carefully. He would want to know that any white doctor he meets will treat our ways with respect, not try to prove they are wrong or primitive. I give you my word, Dr. Patterson said solemnly. I come as a student, not as a judge. What I've seen here today has challenged everything I thought I knew about the limits of medical science. Over the next hour, the three of them discussed the possibilities and obstacles to such a meeting. Sarah explained some of the barriers from the native perspective, decades of broken promises, cultural misunderstandings, and the very real fear that sharing sacred knowledge might lead to its exploitation or corruption. Dr. Patterson acknowledged these concerns and shared his own challenges. Many of his colleagues would view any cooperation with Indian medicine as unscientific and unprofessional. He would be risking his reputation by pursuing this course. But if we could prove that native treatments have genuine medical value, he argued, it could change how both our peoples view each other. Medicine could become a bridge instead of another source of division. As the afternoon wore on, Thomas found himself energized by the discussion in ways he hadn't felt in years. This was exactly the kind of meaningful work that Joseph had hinted at, using his unique position as someone trusted by both communities to facilitate understanding and cooperation. There's something else to consider, Thomas said as the conversation developed. Sarah, your father mentioned that hatred is a poison that kills the one who carries it. Maybe this is true for our peoples as well as for individuals. The constant suspicion and conflict between whites and natives is poisoning everyone. Sarah nodded thoughtfully. My father often speaks of the need to build understanding. He says that fear grows in darkness, but knowledge brings light. Perhaps it is time to try a new path. Dr. Patterson leaned forward with growing excitement. What if we started small? What if I could arrange for some of my most open-minded colleagues to observe native healing techniques? Not to criticize or interfere, but simply to learn. And perhaps some native healers could visit our hospital to see how we treat certain conditions. You would let native people into your hospital? Sarah asked with surprise. If it means advancing medical knowledge and helping patients, yes, Dr. Patterson replied firmly. Healing should have no color barriers. As the sun began to set, they had outlined the framework for what would become an unprecedented collaboration between native and white medicine in the Montana Territory. It would start with a single meeting between Dr. Patterson and Joseph Running Bear, facilitated by Thomas and translated by Sarah. I'll speak with my father tomorrow, Sarah promised as she prepared to mount her horse. If he agrees, we can arrange the meeting for next week. Dr. Patterson shook hands with both Thomas and Sarah, his face bright with enthusiasm. This could be the beginning of something truly revolutionary. Imagine if we could combine the best of both medical traditions, native knowledge of healing plants and spiritual wellness with modern surgical techniques and scientific understanding. After the two visitors had departed, Thomas stood in his yard watching the stars emerge in the clear night sky. The events of the past week had transformed not only his health, but his entire purpose in life. From a dying, isolated rancher, he had become a bridge between two worlds that desperately needed to understand each other better. The irony was not lost on him. He had given away his last bottle of medicine to help a native child, not expecting anything in return. That simple act of compassion had saved not only his own life, but had set in motion events that could potentially help hundreds of others. As he prepared for bed that night, Thomas fingered the small charm that Sarah had given him. The stone still felt warm against his skin, and he was beginning to understand that it represented something much larger than a simple token of gratitude. It was a symbol of connection across cultural boundaries, a reminder that healing could flow in all directions when people opened their hearts to possibility. Tomorrow would bring new challenges as he worked to arrange this historic meeting between Joseph Running Bear and Dr. Patterson. There would be suspicion to overcome, traditions to respect, and the delicate work of translation that went far beyond converting words from one language to another. But Thomas felt ready for whatever lay ahead. The spirits had indeed had plans for him, and those plans were just beginning to unfold. The medicine that had saved one native child was about to become the foundation for healing an entire community's divisions. The real work was just beginning. 2 weeks later, Thomas Mackenzie stood nervously in the main room of his cabin, arranging chairs around his kitchen table in preparation for a meeting that would have been unimaginable just a month before. Dr. William Patterson would arrive shortly with 2 of his most trusted colleagues, while Joseph Running Bear was bringing Sarah White Dove and another medicine man from a neighboring tribe. The cabin had been transformed for the occasion. Thomas had moved his furniture to create an open space where both groups could sit comfortably, respecting the native preference for circle arrangements while accommodating the white doctor's expectation of a more formal setting. Sweet grass and sage burned in small bowls, filling the room with the sacred scents that Joseph had requested. Thomas checked his pocket watch nervously. In 15 minutes, 2 very different worlds would meet in his simple cabin, brought together by a chain of events that had started with a single act of kindness. The weight of responsibility felt enormous. The sound of approaching horses announced the arrival of the first group. Thomas looked out to see Dr. Patterson riding up with 2 other men in dark coats and proper hats. Behind them came a wagon carrying various medical instruments and supplies that Patterson had brought to demonstrate modern techniques. "Thomas," Dr. Patterson called out as he dismounted. "I'd like you to meet Dr. Samuel Morrison from our hospital, and Dr. James Crawford, who specializes in lung diseases. Gentlemen, this is Thomas Mackenzie, the man whose remarkable recovery brought us all together." Dr. Morrison was a thin, serious man with wire-rimmed spectacles who looked like he would rather be anywhere else. Dr. Crawford appeared more open but clearly skeptical about what they were doing. Thomas shook hands with both men, sensing their discomfort with the unusual situation. "I want to thank you all for coming," Thomas said as they entered the cabin. "I know this is unusual, but I believe what we're attempting here could benefit many people." "Indeed," Dr. Patterson agreed, though Thomas noticed him glance around nervously at the burning herbs and circular arrangement of furniture. "Though I must admit, I'm not entirely sure how to proceed with something like this." Before Thomas could respond, they heard the distinctive sound of native drums approaching through the trees. The 3 doctors immediately tensed, their hands instinctively moving toward their coat pockets where Thomas suspected they carried small pistols. "Relax," Thomas said firmly. "The drumming is ceremonial, a way of announcing their peaceful intentions. Joseph Running Bear is a man of great wisdom and dignity. Treat him with the same respect you would show to any distinguished colleague." The drumming stopped just outside the cabin, and Thomas opened the door to greet Joseph Running Bear, Sarah White Dove, and an older man he didn't recognize. Joseph looked exactly as impressive as Thomas remembered, tall, dignified, with long gray braids, and traditional clothing decorated with intricate beadwork. "Thomas Mackenzie," Joseph said formally, "I am honored to return to your home. May I present Gray Wolf, medicine man of the Crow people, who has traveled far to be part of this gathering." Gray Wolf was perhaps even older than Joseph, with a weathered face that spoke of decades of accumulated wisdom. His eyes were sharp and intelligent, taking in everything about the white doctors with careful assessment. Sarah White Dove stepped forward with a bundle in her arms. "Mr. Mackenzie, my daughter Little Moon wanted to give you this." She unwrapped a small pair of beaded moccasins, clearly made by child's hands with loving but imperfect stitches. She made them herself to thank you for saving her life. Thomas accepted the gift with genuine emotion, touched by the thought of the little girl he had helped working so carefully to create something beautiful for him. "Please tell her they're perfect, and I'll treasure them always." The formal introductions were awkward at first. Dr. Patterson stepped forward with professional courtesy, but Thomas could see the tension in the room from both sides. The white doctors were out of their element, unsure how to interact with people they had been taught to view as primitive. The native healers were equally wary, having experienced too many broken promises and cultural dismissals from white authority figures. "Perhaps we should begin by sharing our different approaches to the same goal," Thomas suggested, hoping to break the ice. "We're all here because we want to help sick people get better. The methods may be different, but the purpose is the same." Joseph Running Bear nodded approvingly, and spoke in rapid Blackfoot to Grey Wolf, who replied in his own language before Joseph translated. Grey Wolf says that healing has many faces but only one heart. He is willing to share knowledge with those who come seeking wisdom rather than trying to prove superiority. Dr. Patterson cleared his throat nervously. We deeply appreciate your willingness to meet with us. As men of science, we're always eager to learn about effective treatments, regardless of their origin. Science, Grey Wolf repeated in accented English, speaking directly for the first time. This is your word for understanding the natural world, yes? We have different words, but the goal is the same, to understand how the Great Spirit works through plants and bodies and minds to restore balance. Dr. Morrison leaned forward with obvious skepticism. With all due respect, we deal in proven facts and measurable results, not spiritual beliefs. The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Sarah translated Morrison's words into Blackfoot, and Thomas watched Joseph's expression harden slightly. Dr. Morrison, Thomas intervened quickly. Perhaps we could focus on specific treatments rather than philosophical differences. Joseph, would you be willing to explain how you helped my lung condition? These doctors are particularly interested in the herbal medicines you used. Joseph considered the request carefully before nodding. I will share some knowledge, but you must understand that our medicine is not just plants and procedures. It is relationship between healer and patient, between human and nature, between physical body and spiritual essence. If you try to use our plants without understanding our ways, they will not work as well. Could you give us an example? Dr. Crawford asked, his scientific curiosity overcoming his skepticism. Joseph gestured to Sarah, who began pulling various dried plants from a leather bag. For lung sickness like Thomas had, we use these 4 medicines together. He held up different bundles as he spoke. Pine needle tea to clean the mucus, wild cherry bark to stop the cough, sage to purify the spirit. And this, he showed them a plant Thomas didn't recognize, to give strength back to damaged tissue. Dr. Patterson examined the plants with professional interest. These first 3 I actually recognize. Pine needles contain vitamin C and expectorants. Wild cherry does have cough suppressant properties. Sage has antimicrobial qualities. But this last one, I've never seen it before. It grows only in certain places, at certain times of year, Grey Wolf explained. And it must be gathered with proper ceremony, with permission from the plant's spirit. This is what your science does not understand. The relationship between all living things. Spirit of the plant. Dr. Morrison scoffed. Really, gentlemen, we're educated men. Surely we can discuss these matters without resorting to primitive superstitions. This time, Joseph Running Bear stood up abruptly, his dignity clearly offended. You call our ways primitive, yet your patient was dying, and you could not save him. We healed him completely in 3 days. Which approach should be called primitive? Thomas quickly moved to prevent the meeting from falling apart. Gentlemen, please. We're not here to judge each other's beliefs, but to learn from each other's successes. Dr. Morrison, these men traveled days through dangerous weather to save my life, asking nothing in return. Surely that deserves our respect. Dr. Patterson, recognizing the crisis, stepped in to support Thomas. My colleague spoke carelessly. We apologize for any offense. We're here to learn, not to criticize. Sarah White Dove had been watching the exchange with growing frustration. Now she stood and addressed the white doctors directly. You want to understand native medicine? Then, first understand this. We do not separate the mind from the body, or the person from their community, or the human from the natural world. Everything is connected. When you treat only symptoms without addressing the whole person, you may stop the immediate problem, but you do not create true health. That's actually quite insightful, Dr. Crawford admitted reluctantly. Modern medicine does tend to focus on specific diseases rather than overall wellness. Grey Wolf seized on this opening. Yes, you see the broken bone, but not the sadness that made the person careless. You see the fever, but not the spiritual imbalance that weakened their resistance. We see all of it together. For the next 2 hours, the conversation gradually became more productive. The native healers demonstrated several of their techniques, explaining not just what they did, but why they believed it worked. The white doctors shared their knowledge of anatomy and disease processes, describing how they understood illness and recovery. Thomas found himself serving as translator not just of languages, but of entire ways of thinking. When the doctors talked about scientific proof, he helped the native healers understand their need for measurable evidence. When Joseph described spiritual balance, Thomas helped the doctors see this as what they might call mental health, and stress management. The breakthrough came when Dr. Crawford asked about pain management. We use laudanum and morphine, but both are highly addictive. Do your people have safer alternatives? Joseph and Gray Wolf exchanged knowing looks before Joseph answered. We have several plants that ease pain without creating the hunger for more. Some work on the body, others on the mind's perception of pain. Would you like to learn about them? Very much so, Dr. Crawford replied eagerly. What followed was a detailed discussion of native pain management techniques that fascinated all the white doctors. They learned about willow bark tea, which contained what they recognized as a natural form of aspirin, and various other plants that had genuine analgesic properties. This could help so many of our patients, Dr. Patterson said excitedly, especially those who've become dependent on opium-based medicines. But remember what Joseph said, Thomas cautioned. The plants are just part of the treatment. The relationship between healer and patient, the addressing of spiritual and emotional factors, these seem to be essential components too. As the afternoon wore on, both sides began to see possibilities for collaboration that none of them had imagined when they arrived. The native healers were impressed by the white doctors' surgical techniques and their knowledge of anatomy. The white doctors were amazed by the sophistication of native herbal medicine and their holistic approach to health. What if we could establish a clinic where both traditions work together? Dr. Patterson suggested as the meeting drew to a close. Native healers could provide plant medicines and spiritual counseling, while we handle surgery and medical emergencies. Joseph Running Bear considered this proposal carefully. Such a thing could benefit many people, but it would require great trust and respect from both sides. Your people would need to accept that our ways are not primitive, and my people would need to believe that yours are not trying to steal or corrupt our knowledge. How do we build that kind of trust? Dr. Morrison asked, his earlier skepticism replaced by genuine curiosity. Sarah White Dove smiled for the first time since the meeting began. You start the same way Thomas did, with one small act of kindness, given without expecting anything in return. Trust grows slowly, one person at a time. As the meeting ended and both groups prepared to depart, Thomas realized that something historic had just taken place in his simple cabin. Not a complete solution to the divisions between their peoples, but a genuine beginning. Seeds had been planted that could grow into something remarkable if tended carefully. Joseph Running Bear approached Thomas as the others gathered their belongings. The spirits spoke truly when they said you had important work to do. Today you have begun to heal more than just your own body. You have begun to heal the wounds between our peoples. This was just the start, Thomas replied. There will be much more work to do. Yes, Joseph agreed with a knowing smile. But remember, the greatest healing always begins with the smallest act of compassion. You gave medicine to a sick child, and from that single act, all of this has grown. Never underestimate the power of a kind heart. As both groups rode away in different directions, Thomas stood in his doorway holding the tiny moccasins that little Moon had made for him. In 6 weeks, he had gone from a dying, isolated rancher to a bridge between two worlds. His cabin had become a place where ancient wisdom and modern science could meet in mutual respect. The story that had begun with a dying rancher giving his last bottle of medicine to a native child had grown into something far larger than any of them could have imagined. It had become a story about the healing power of compassion, the possibility of understanding across cultural divides, and the profound truth that the medicine that saves one life can ultimately heal an entire community. But, perhaps most importantly, it had become a story about hope. Hope that differences could become strengths when approached with open hearts and minds. Hope that the walls between peoples could be torn down one act of kindness at a time. And hope that healing, in all its forms, was always possible for those brave enough to reach across the divide. The winter snow was melting, and spring was coming to the Montana Territory. With it would come new challenges, new opportunities, and new chances to prove that the medicine of compassion knows no boundaries of race, culture, or creed.